Hi, welcome to another episode of Tea with Tara, Conversations about Writing. Today we have a very special guest, a professor of mine, a former professor from Penn State University, Dr. Philip Mosley. Dr. Mosley is a distinguished professor emeritus of English and comparative literature at Penn State University. He has been an associate editor of comparative literature studies and has served on the board of the Pennsylvania Humanities Council. He writes occasionally for music magazines on jazz, 60s soul, and 50s rock and roll, and has a keen interest in local history. He's also written several books, which I'll have him tell you about in a few moments. Dr. Mosley is a native of England who immigrated to the United States in 1988. He attended Norwich schools from 1957 to 1965 and holds a BA in English from the University of Leeds, an MA in European literature, and a PhD in comparative literature, both from the University of East Anglia. So in a few moments, we will be talking to Dr. Mosley and finding out what makes him interested in the subjects he chooses to write about and what makes him love writing so much. And as always, grab your tea or your coffee, and we'll get started in just a few minutes on Tea with Tara. See you then. Hi, and welcome back to Tea with Tara, Conversations about Writing. We are now joined by a former professor of mine, Dr. Philip Mosley. Dr. Mosley, welcome.
Thank you, Tara. Good to be here.
So I want to first start off asking you about how do you, of course, you are a professor and a writer, but what do you see yourself as more? Are you a writer who is a professor or a professor who writes?
The latter now, since I retired from my position, university position in 2017. So I think it would be fair to say that I'm a writer and a professor, since I still hold a professorial title, but yeah, that way around.
And when did you realize that you had a love of writing? How did that begin?
Well, it goes back to my very early years, actually. When I was in elementary school in Norwich, England, it became pretty clear to my teachers quite early on that I had a talent for writing to the degree that I was set aside from other members of the class. I know this sounds a bit, a bit puffing myself up a bit, but this is the truth. I was set because I was so far in advance in terms of reading and writing of my fellow students in the class. So what the teachers would do, I was 7, 8 years old. What the teachers would do, and I still have a very strong memory of this, even though it's all those years ago, is they would put me to one side and give me exercise books and just say to me, basically, go for it, fill them up, let it rip. And I would write stories and little essays, obviously 7 or 8 year old style stories and essays, but writing nonetheless. And that's really where it all started, when I was given that. And I owe a lot to those this is back in the 50s, where we didn't think a lot of educational establishments were, so to speak, progressive in their methods. But boy, oh boy, my teachers back then, all those years ago, they were progressive. They saw that I, for better, I had a talent for writing and I was a good reader. So rather than hold me back, they encouraged me to let my imagination free. And that's where it started. And I don't claim that I had some kind of really precocious talent, but clearly I was above average in that respect. And that's really where it began. And it developed in my student years when I was an undergraduate at the University of Leeds in England. I got really interested in poetry. And I'd love reading poetry right through high school, but I started to write poetry. Now, I make no claims for it. Again, I was 18, 19 years old, And a lot of that stuff, some of which I still have for one reason or another, a lot of that stuff is, it's adolescent verse. It's the musings of an 18, 19-year-old man, young man. But it did occur to me that, clearly writing was something very fundamental to me, that I was interested in writing more than just writing essays as a student, which I also enjoyed doing, by the way. And just doing things that, just doing writing that was connected with my schoolwork. So, I have a body of poems, some of which were halfway decent, I think, but the majority of which were basically juvenilia. And that carried me through into my 20s. And eventually, of course, to cut a long story short, when I opted for an academic career and started out as a junior professor, my writing, of course, became a daily part of my life, except the difference was that I really put the creative writing to one side, something which in retrospect I regret, but I put the creative writing to one side and I concentrated on what my professional vocation asked of me, and that was to be a scholarly writer, to write academic articles and books.
Have you
So,
ever,
I'm sorry.
oh no, I'm sorry. Have you ever written fiction?
No, I haven't. I've always been a bit scared of the idea of writing fiction. You may know, of course, that, short stories or novels for that matter, because it's always struck me as being extraordinarily demanding to be able to pull off fiction of any kind. And you may know that Flannery O'Connor, I know she's one of your favorite writers and one of mine too. Flannery O'Connor famously said once, when she was asked why she had not produced novels, she was famous for her short stories. She said, "Oh, novel writing is a terrible experience, or novel writing must be a terrible experience. You lose your hair and your teeth decay." And that was her take on it. In other words, to do it properly, it would.
Or you start to drink a lot.
Yes, right, that too. Your health would suffer. You'd probably become an alcoholic. It would take years and years and years, so your body would age in the process. So no, the answer to that is no, I never have. I mentioned poetry, and I've also always enjoyed writing articles. I don't mean scholarly ones, articles about things that I'm enthusiastic about, music, for example, local history. And I suppose you could say that the history side of my writing has come right back into the frame. When I was in high school and thinking about what I might major in at university, it was a toss-up between history and English. I was one of the top 2 or 3 history students in my year, and my history teacher wanted me to major in history, thought I had a great future. And I love history. I always have done, and my work has always, I think, reflected that interest in history and historical context. And in the end, I thought to myself, what do I want to spend 3 years doing? Because the BA in the United Kingdom is 3 years, not 4. What do I want to spend 3 years doing? Reading novels and poetry and plays, or reading, dusty historical tomes? And it was the answer to that self-question was a no-brainer. So I chose the English major, and I don't regret it, of course, because my love of literature carried me happily along there. But I could have easily become a historian, is what I'm trying to say. And in the few years since I retired, I've turned my attention again, partly to writing history, which I'd never done before. And I've just completed a book of local history, the first history book I've ever written. And it's about how we tell the story of the anthracite region of northeastern Pennsylvania. It's kind of a little bit my my tribute to this area that I've lived in for over 30 years now. And that history is always, that history of anthracite, of the anthracite region, has always fascinated me ever since I came to northeastern Pennsylvania. So I thought, well, you know, since I want to try my hand at writing a history book, why not take that as a subject? So,
and it's a good subject, especially in this area, as so many of us have ancestors who were coal miners. My great-grandfather was a coal miner who suffered from black lung. So it is a good subject. I look forward to reading that.
Yeah, well, the number of people who've said to me what you've just said, oh, you know, my great-grandfather or somebody in my family was involved in the coal industry. I mean, I hear that all the time. So I understand how deep those roots run in this particular part of the country.
So when I was an English major in college, and I had a lot of classmates who said they wanted to be writers, but they were under the impression that in order to be a writer, you don't have to be a reader. So as an English professor, if a student came up to you and said, I want to be a writer, but I don't have to read, I don't like reading, I don't need to read, what would be your answer to that?
Well, my immediate answer might be, I think you need to see a psychotherapist. Because you've got very, very, very serious mental problems, psychological problems. Well, in short, Tara, I think that's an absolutely absurd notion. I don't believe it's possible to be a good writer without being a good and extensive reader. You can be a writer if you like. Nobody's stopping anyone from putting pen to paper. But the results, if you're not a reader, in my book, are unlikely to be worth reading.
Right. And who are some of the writers that have inspired you, and some of the books that have also inspired you?
Well, of course, that's a very big question, because in many, many decades of non-stop reading, I've discovered the most phenomenal stuff of all kinds, in literature, but also in other fields, history, biography, and so on, which I like. I'm a big non-fiction reader, but since we're focused particularly, given the context, on the field of literature, I'll stick with that. Writers I like, really, or who have meant a lot to me. When one's tastes do tend to change over the years. When I was a student, I was very taken with the Romantic poets, Wordsworth, Keats, Shelley, all those guys, Coleridge. In fiction, I was a big D.H. Lawrence fan. I guess there was something about Lawrence's, the romanticism that lies at the heart of a lot of Lawrence's writing, and his spiritual questing, that really grabbed me as a young man. Interestingly enough, I still admire Lawrence and respect his work, but when I go back to it and dip into it now, it doesn't have the same impact on me as it did back then. I find it altogether less convincing than when I was a young man. I think my favorite writer in my student years, and who remains one of my favorite writers, is W.B. Yeats. I would argue that Yeats, in my opinion anyway, is the finest English language poet of the 20th century. And I mean, there have been many, many, many of them, and that's a very subjective opinion. But I've always loved Yeats' poetry, and I still read it regularly. It's a book that I turn to very frequently, his collected poems. I've also rediscovered a lot of writers, which I think is an interesting experience. Writers whom I read when I was much younger, either for study purposes or just when I was younger, particularly classic authors, whom I then put to one side and kind of said to myself, okay, been there, done that, I've read them. And then as a much older man, thought to myself, you know, I'd like to go back and revisit some of these writers, because did I really understand their books when I read them when I was younger? And the answer to that self-question is, to a great extent, no. I have not fully appreciated a lot of these writers. So just to give you a good example, the great Russian novelists of the 19th century, I had grazed and to some degree lost myself as a young man in writers like Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Turgenev, Chekhov, great writers. And then kind of said to myself, okay, well, that's that. I know the Russian writers, and I couldn't have been more mistaken about that, because in the last few years I've come back to them, and I reread some Dostoevsky, for example, the Brothers Karamazov, which is a wonderful, wonderful novel. I'm currently revisiting Tolstoy, not the great monster epics, not War and Peace or Anna Karenina, so much as his shorter fiction, which is wonderful. I'm reading the Kreutzer Sonata at present, which is a novella. It's absolutely wonderful stuff. And I realized, just how good Tolstoy is and how I hadn't really appreciated him. Maybe it's just a matter of when one grows older, when one has a mature appreciation of literature, one can appreciate certain writers more than one could back then. Turgenev, I reread First Love, which I'd read first when I was about 20 years old. Wonderful, I love it. It was as good, it was as fresh in its writing now as it was back then. So just as one example, the great Russian novelists of the 19th century.
And how do you come to choose the subjects that you write about?
It's not terribly scientific or methodical, I'll be honest with you. My temperament is such that I tend to want to write about things that, for one reason or another, grab me and I get enthused about. And there's no telling what those subjects are or where they may come at me from. So I don't, if you look at my list of publications over my career, I've done a lot of different things. I knew early on, and again, it's perhaps partly to do with my personality, partly to do with my outlook on the world. I knew very early on that I didn't want to become one of those writers, or particularly one of those professors who spent his whole career basically writing about one type of literature or one author. I didn't want to, it may be because my boredom threshold's pretty low. And after I've completed a writing project, I tend to have OD'd on it. And as a result, I want to switch my attention to something completely different. And so I tend to go quite radically from one thing to another. And I'll just explain that briefly with the three most recent examples of books I've written. About 8 years ago, I did a lot of writing on cinema during my career, as you may know. And I taught film studies as well as literature. About 8 years ago, I wrote a book on the Belgian realist film directors, two brothers, Jean-Pierre and Luc Dardenne, who, have done the most wonderful gritty social realist movies. And I wrote a book on their work called Responsible Realism, the cinema of the Dardenne brothers. Okay, I love doing it and I love their work. When I'd finished that book, I not only didn't want to do any more on the Dardennes at that moment in time, but I didn't want to write another cinema book. I found I was rediscovering my desire to write about literature. So I completely, switched tracks. And a couple of years ago, as you'll know, I wrote a collection of personal essays on writers who have influenced me, which I called Resuming Maurice. And there you go. And other essays on writers and celebrity. I mean, a complete change from the Dardennes book. But one I enjoyed writing very much because it was not so much, I mean, it's scholarly, I hope, but it's not an academic book. It's a very personal book. And I love the whole thing in contemporary literature where writers do a lot of genre bending, and they put stuff, you know, they mix and match and all kinds of different strategies. And I tried to do a little of that in that book, which you know, and you know, I appreciate the fact that you enthusiastically read that book. I tried to include elements of my own personal experience in the book, so that my writing about the writers was also partly about my own discovery of those writers and what they had meant to me at different times in my life. And so when Resuming Maurice was finished, I thought, okay, I could do more of this, but I want to switch. I felt that need. There's something deep in my writing psyche that says to me, do something completely different, you know, get into a different groove next time round. And so I decided then to write the history book. As a result, Telling of the Anthracite, a Pennsylvania post history, was the next book I wrote.
You know, getting back to Resuming Maurice, one of the things that I noticed, you explore a lot of themes like narcissism, and also how fame can be a double-edged sword, as in the case of Dylan Thomas. And so I want to ask you, what do you think contributes to the self-destruction of so many writers? Is it the fame itself? What is it that you think?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, and it's linked to that age-old question about, you know, do we need agony in our lives to be good artists? And that's a very big question that we can't get into right now. But to answer your question more succinctly, I think sometimes it's to do with fame. If fame, you know, fame can go to a writer's head and can derail that writer. But I think it's more likely to be something that has pre-existed in that writer's personality and makeup. Something to do maybe with the artistic temperament, producing personalities who may often, not in every case, there are some very level-headed good writers, but can produce personalities who are in some ways, you know, slightly disturbed, who live on the edge, who are extremely unpredictable because of that artistic temperament. They see life in very unusual and sometimes rather risky and dangerous ways. And I think that can sometimes be behind the whole idea of people, you know, of writers self-immolating, if you like, imploding, whatever. Certainly in the case of Thomas, I mean, his fame had something to do with it, although I think he courted fame and he didn't dislike. Some writers don't like being in the public eye. They become recluses, you know, people like J.D. Salinger, for example, a famous recluse. But Dylan Thomas liked to be in the public eye. What did him in, of course, was drinking.
Right.
And, you know, sadly, for better or for worse, and we see this in, you know, in literature, in art, in popular music, some of the outstanding artists do themselves in as a result of, dare I say, needing to resort to drink or drugs or whatever. And that's a very, you know, sadly, it's a very familiar refrain.
You know,
and if I may just add, why do they resort to substance abuse? Maybe it's partly because they are these artistic types who live on the edge. And if you live on the edge, sometimes you tumble, you know, if you're not careful, you tumble over.
Right, that's true. Also in the case, I guess, of anybody famous, right? Actors, actresses.
Yeah.
Now, in the case of fiction, do you believe that authors should be identified with their work? Like, in other words, literary critics seem to be so interested in drawing parallels between the author and their work. Is that fair to the writer?
That's a very good.
Kind of creating like a maybe sometimes even a false biographical sketch of the author. Like, in other words, Stephen King, if you saw the movie The Shining or read the book, I'm sure that he doesn't go around the house running after his wife with an axe. So it'd be
at least we imagine.
We hope not.
It's a very good question. I mean, modern literary theory tends to encourage one to, disassociate the writer from the text. The text is not in any way really to do with the writer.
The author is dead, right? Once they
The
put
author,
the work
yeah,
out there.
the death of the author and all that stuff. I mean, personally, I don't buy that. I'm perhaps old school in that respect, but I do believe in the notion of intentionality in writing. I do believe that, that when a writer sits down to write, that writer's intention is going to translate into, in some way, whether consciously or unconsciously, into the written word that appears in the text. I certainly don't think one should always be drawing parallels between a writer and that writer's writing. But by the same token, I think it's dangerous to discount the biographical context of a writer's life. And you'll recall, having been a student of mine, that in my literature teaching, I was always very big on historical context of a writer's career, because I feel that one can understand a writer's work better if one has a good grasp, not only of that writer's life and outlook on life, but also of the period of time and the culture and society in which that writer operated.
Right. And, I dealt with this a little when I wrote my first novel, Look Back to Yesterday, and I was doing some events. And it seemed like people were more interested in the biographical facts in the novel rather than the story itself, the plot, the characters. Who were the characters based on? Did that really happen? This must have. So sometimes, as a writer, I find it a little difficult when people are constantly worried about whether that story mirrors my real life rather than the story itself and character.
Yeah, and I mean, you're right to be a bit bothered by that, because there's absolutely no reason why a literary text should have any direct or even indirect parallels with the writer's life. It's one thing to say, as I did, that, I think intentionality is still authorial intention is still an important factor in writing, but I think it's absurd to kind of have an expectation that somehow what's in the novel must be reflecting specific events in the writer's life. There are writers who deliberately set out to write novels of that kind, and it's a long established subgenre known as the roman à clé in French, or the novel with a key. In other words, each event and each character, you can, if you go to the key, so to speak, behind it, you'll find a particular person or a particular time and place. But that's a very specific subgenre. But in general, no, I think no writer is under any obligation to make his or her fictional text correspond to things in their own life.
So what is your writing process like? Do you write in the daytime, at night? Do you have any writing quirks? Do you have to have music on?
Yeah, great question. This is going to show my age. When I was a young man, I wrote a lot at night. I wrote my PhD dissertation at night because it was quiet and I wasn't distracted by anything else. Now, as somebody who's pretty long in the tooth, I write first thing in the morning, often quite early, because that's the only time of day, I'll freely admit this, the only time of day when my brain still functions halfway decently. And I'm an early riser, and I'll often find myself writing at, 6, 7 o'clock in the morning. Usually writing for me now is a morning thing. By the afternoon, I'm beginning to get fatigued, and in the evening, my brain is fried. I can only do other things. I certainly couldn't do any serious writing in the evening. As for distractions, I cannot have anything else going on at the same time. I have to have absolute quiet for writing. I don't even have, I love music, but I can't have music on when I'm trying to write. So I sit at my desk or wherever with silence, as much silence as I can summon up to surround me. And I tend to, more in the last few years, maybe again it's to do with retirement and not feeling I'm under any sort of obligation to produce things in a certain way. I've gone back a lot to just starting off handwriting, writing in a notebook with a pencil and an eraser. And then once I've got something shaped up, transferring it to the computer. But obviously when it reaches that stage, then the computer takes over. But I still like very much to write by hand. And in the summer, I live in a rural location. In the summertime, I put my feet up on a recliner under a tree in my backyard, and I write outside in the shade, birds singing around me. I don't mind birds singing, they don't distract me. And I really enjoy that kind of fresh air composition, shall we say.
Have you ever suffered from writer's block?
Oh, yeah.
And what do you do about that?
Well, a professor of mine at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, Christopher Smith, who's a professor of European literature, he once told a class, and I've never forgotten this, he said, look, he said, if you're trying to write an essay and you're faced with writer's block, you don't know how to start. He said, my suggestion is you uncork a good bottle of red, have a few glasses of that, and then let it go, let it rip. And he said, usually whatever goes down on the paper doesn't really matter what it's like, even if they're semi-inebriated ravings, you've got something down on paper, right? And you've broken your writer's block. But joking apart, it can be a very, very serious thing for writers. I've suffered from it. I think the writer who says I never have writer's block is a liar.
Yeah.
I think everybody has those moments when you simply do not know what you're going to do next or how you're going to make a start. And I mentioned writing outdoors. One ploy that I've often had up my sleeve is to take a long walk in the woods.
Favorite pastime of so many writers.
Yeah, go for a good long walk, because the your brain gets oxygenated. You're in pleasant surroundings, and I've found that ideas for what to write sometimes pop into my head, and then when I get back to the house and sit down and write them down, and that's one way of getting past a block. Maybe it's simply physiologically, maybe it's to do with making sure there's enough oxygen circulating in your brain. I don't know, but no, it's a problem that everybody has, and I've had those moments myself. Yeah.
So one of the questions I'm interested in your answer, I ask everyone on the show this question: if you could sit down with one famous writer, living or dead, who would that be, and what would that conversation sound like?
Well, you put me on the spot here, Tara, but I'll see if I can come up with something. Which writer would it be? Besides
me. That's already established.
Living or dead? Well, we were talking about writer's block. I've got respondent's block at this moment. It's such it would seem like it might be an easy question. It's actually a very difficult one. I don't think I can answer that off the cuff.
Okay, well, how about you just tell us some of the books that you have written?
Oh, sure. Well, I mentioned the three most recent ones: the local history book on how we tell the anthracite story. Before that, Resuming Maurice, about writers and celebrity. Before that, the Dardenne brothers' realist cinema. I've written quite a few on literature and quite a few on cinema before that. What I would like to mention, because it's writing after all, is another part of my profile as a writer, and that's literary translation. For many years, I've translated from French to English. And I've been particularly interested in Belgian writers who write in French, because French is one of the two official languages of that country. And over the years, I've done a lot of translation of Belgian writers, poets, essayists, and novelists. And that has been a remarkably interesting journey, because translation is not just grunt work. It's not just donkey work. Good translation is, in a way, as creative as writing an original text, because the task you're faced with in doing translation from one language to another is not just, are you capturing the language correctly? In other words, are you being faithful, if you like, to the language that was used in the original? But are you able to capture the spirit and the feel of that text? And when you put it from one language into another, that is not an easy task. And to give you an example of poetry, I was shortlisted for an international prize for a poetry translation I did back in 2010. It's a collection of poems called The Book of the Snow. Beautiful, very Zen-like winter poems by the Belgian writer François Jacquemin. And not only was my task to try to be as faithful as was possible to Jacquemin's original language, but also to try to capture the atmosphere that he created in those poems, and also the worldview, if you like, the philosophy that was behind it. And when you try to do that in another language, you often have to have resort to different words, different phrases, different concepts of language in order to pull it off, because you can't just simply go to the dictionary, and just look up one word and say, okay, I've got that one, now that's that done. You've got to think about the whole picture and whether the translation is going to work on a number of levels. On the linguistic level, is it an accurate and fair version of the original text? But also, is the spirit of that captured? And in the case of poetry, have you managed to capture the form in a way that works as well in English as it does in French? In my case, working with French. Because the thing you have to remember there with poetry is that the form of poetry in different languages is very different too. The meter, the rhyme schemes, the line lengths, all that stuff may be very different in English, in English verse, than it is in French, and you could say the same for just about any language. So poetry translation is particularly difficult because you've got to go beyond just knowing what the original words mean and putting them down in English. You've got to go to a level where the poem that you come up with in English reads well in English.
Right. Doesn't
read like simply a French poem dumped on the English page. Because if you do that, it's not going to work. So prose is easier. If you're translating fiction, you can be somewhat more literal. You don't have quite so many problems of form and structure as you do if you're translating poetry. But even translating fiction, translating prose, you've still got a lot of the same problems to confront. The good translator has to understand that you have an obligation to be faithful to the original, but at the same time, you have an obligation to the English reader to produce something that's going to read well and imaginatively in the English language.
Right. Well, unfortunately, Dr. Mosley, we are out of time, but this has been
what a shame, Tara.
I know this has been a fascinating conversation. Now, just to let our viewers know, where can they find your books? Are they on Amazon?
Yeah, the majority of them are on Amazon. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah. So Dr. Mosley, thank you so much. This has been really wonderful, fascinating conversation. Thanks for being part of this.
Okay, Tara, it was my pleasure.
And good luck with your writing. I look forward to reading your book on anthracite.
And good luck with yours, of course.
Thank you. So that concludes another episode of Tea with Tara, Conversations About Writing. I want to thank my guest, Dr. Philip Mosley, for being on the show and sharing such wonderful insight about his writing career and his teaching career as well. So stay tuned for the next episode. Not sure when that'll be, maybe in another week or so. But as always, if you have a story locked inside of you, dying to get out, you might be a writer. So until next time, happy writing.